In this episode of the Primate Cast, distinguished professor and primatologist, Dr. Sarah Brosnan.
Evolution,
communication,
cognition,
conservation,
behavior,
primatology,
typically primates.
Become the monkey.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another installment of the Primate Cast. I'm your host, Andrew McIntosh, from Kyoto University's Wildlife Research Center, and this program is brought to you by our Center for the International Collaboration in Advanced Studies in Primatology. In this episode, I'm really excited to be able to bring to you an interview I conducted with Dr. Sarah Brosnan in February of this year. Sarah is Distinguished Professor of Psychology, Philosophy, and Neuroscience in the Language Research Center at Georgia State University. She's probably best known for her work on inequity aversion in primates. We'll talk a lot about that in the interview. But also she's a world expert in the study of how animals generally make decisions. So she was visiting in Japan some colleagues and setting up collaborative research. So I also asked Dr. Ikuma Adachi of the Center for Evolutionary Origins of Human Behavior and one of Sarah's oldest friends and colleagues here in Japan to join us. In the interview, we talk a fair amount about her work with fairness in non-human primates, going back to her early experiments published in Nature that showed how capuchin monkeys are sensitive to what others receive for the same amount of work that they do, and how they reject unequal pay. For anyone wondering what that might look like, I highly recommend you check out a video of these experiments on YouTube. Just search for Capuchin Monkey Fairness Experiment on YouTube, and I guarantee you'll not be disappointed. Certainly not as disappointed as that capuchin was after watching a neighbor get a whole bunch of grapes for doing the same thing and only receiving a cucumber itself. So yeah, we kind of all know what that feels like. I really love that experiment though, and I teach it year over year to my undergraduate students in Kyoto University studying comparative cognition. It's just so fun to talk about that, but also all of these really clever experiments that cognitive scientists like Sarah Brosnan have been designing for subjects that simply can't tell us what they think about things like fairness. I do try to play a little bit of devil's advocate in the interview and get at some of the challenges that we have in designing experiments and safely interpreting their results. And that led us to some insights into how cognitive scientists like Sarah and like Ikuma think about their studies from multiple vantage points right from the start, but also as a launching off point for more in-depth studies later on. We also talk about Sarah's other line of research into behavioral economics or economic behavior. Sometimes you hear people say it monkeynomics, and what it's been like trying to introduce a research paradigm that can directly compare the behaviors of humans with that of non-human primates across a range of different decision-making tasks. Sarah reflects on what has surprised her most about watching humans do these tasks without first being given a set of instructions like they normally are in psychology experiments, and how our own economic behavior lines up against that of our primate cousins. In addition to being a world-class cognitive scientist, Sarah is also a wonderful personality, and it was a real pleasure here to be able to sit down with her in the studio and record this interview. Recently, she's become a bit of a mentor to me as well in another professional role we collaborate on, so it was wonderful to have some quality time with her as she was visiting other folks here in Japan. The interview itself is on the shorter side, so I definitely want to get in a round 2 with Sarah at some point. But if you, for now, want to know more about her work and what she does and what she's found, you can visit her website at sarah-brosnan.com. That's sarah-brosnan.com. And there are some nice videos linked there. For example, one for TED's Salon, where she engagingly describes her research and how we and other primates are wired for fairness. One thing that kept coming up in her stay and during our conversation, not in the interview, but just more generally, was how important it is to make and maintain long-term friendships in science. Not only for the research impacts, but also just for the fun and companionship of it all. So that's where I thought I'd start the interview, asking Sarah about her interactions with primatologists in Japan. I do want to say, Sarah, thank you so much for joining me here on the Primate Cast, an in-studio primate. I haven't done many of these in-person interviews recently.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, so we just, for a bit of context for the listeners, I just attended your talk where you talked a lot about economic behavior in primates, and we're going to get to that for sure in this interview. And possibly for anyone out there, you may hear some door action in a little while as Ikuma Adachi may join us, or he may not join us for this interview. But maybe I can just ask you to start out by talking about your interactions with Japan and Japanese primatology. I know you and Ikuma go way back. And so what was kind of like your first experience working with Japanese primatologists, and what were you doing?
Yeah. So in 2004, when I was a senior grad student, I got invited to one of the student symposia that they have. And so they're still going on. I know because I was back in 2019 as the keynote speaker. So these cycles continue. But I came, and it was a really excellent conference. And so the students were the ones giving the presentations, and it was set up so that we had just tons of opportunities to spend time together, lots of meals together, lots of sightseeing. And they set it up so that the students were the students in Japan were the ones taking the students not from Japan around. And so we formed friendships. That's where I got to know Yuko Hattori and Shinya Yamamoto and Ikuma. Mm-hmm. And I have been back, I think this is my 6th or 7th trip since then. So I've been back multiple times, including actually to give the keynote and bring my own graduate student in 2019. And I think that's really important because it gave us a chance to form relationships that are hard when you live on opposite sides of the globe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just going to bring Ikuma into the studio now. In real time. Yeah, no problem. Sarah was just telling us about her first visit to Japan and building relationships. And so you were a student you were either a graduate student or early postdoc, you said, when you first came to that conference. Yeah,
I think I was invited when I was a senior grad student, and by the time I got here, I might have been a brand new postdoc, but it was right in that time period. I defended in 2004, so it was right in there somewhere.
Right. And then Ikuma, you, not long after that, ended up in the U.S. as well.
Right. I moved to States 2006. Mm-hmm. So 2 years after the symposium, I think, where we met Sarah and other youngsters.
But you've also kept some collaboration as well, some collaborative research. So what is the main kind of collaborations that you've been working on together through the years? Even if not directly, but just kind of as your paths have crossed.
We always share the interest. I mean, mystery is we haven't done actually any direct collaboration so far.
Not yet.
And we are
We're working on it.
Starting it finally. Mm-hmm. But she's more interested in the social cognition on the time, and then on the time I was a little bit more language oriented. Mm-hmm. But then we often talk about it and communication, how it can be key for the social life too. And we always try to see what is really the bridge that we can work together. Mm-hmm. And this time we are a little bit pinned down to the emotional process and affective side of the response. And here is it. It's time for us to recollabate. And then we are here now.
Yep. So you could say we've spent 20 years preparing for this moment.
It's a slow burn, but I'm sure the result... I mean, watching the two of you talk with Ikuma's questions and suggestions and things, it definitely looks like you have a rapport and you can definitely build on that. So I look forward to seeing where that goes.
You should always collaborate with your friends.
Yeah.
Yeah,
really important. And so you were talking about economic behavior in monkeys, and this is, I find, you mentioned earlier to me when we were talking and having lunch that, so you spent a lot of your career talking about inequity and fairness in cooperation. And you're kind of excited to be able to present something different to this audience, which we definitely appreciate. But I couldn't help but noticing there were so many points where the idea of fairness is interwoven into those games as well.
I don't think I'll ever escape it.
And so maybe it would be, we can just start one of the reasons I want to do this too is just talk about the inequity aversion, the kind of iconic study with the capuchins and the cucumbers and grapes. For anyone who's listening and doesn't know the study, it's super fascinating. And the video that you have of it with, I think that's Malini Shuchak, right? Doing the experiments, who also was here for a few months, many years ago.
A couple months, I guess.
Yeah. And so it's just so iconic. And I think it's so easy to connect as a human when you observe that kind of behavior. And so it's incredibly striking. And so for anyone, who's listening, you can definitely check out these. You'll find the paper. You can see the videos on YouTube. It's quite easy, I think.
Yeah.
But what I was interested in is maybe if you could just kind of briefly summarize that story. I'm interested in the process as well of, you mentioned earlier about how you came to to be able to test that. And then I want to lead into like more of the process of how you do comparative cognitive science.
Sure. Well, that one in particular emerged from watching the monkeys. So when I was a grad student, Frans was my advisor. And he always said, and I tell my students now, that the best questions come from watching your monkeys or your animals. And one afternoon I was out back feeding the monkeys and trying to get the alpha male to stay to the side while I was giving peanuts to everybody else, which involves a lot of holding a peanut way out to the side to tempt him over while you're feeding the monkeys with your other hand. And he got frustrated and ran back into the indoor area of their enclosure and started bringing out things and trying to trade them with me, which capuchins trade pretty spontaneously. So that wasn't a surprise. But first he brought out a piece of primate chow, and then he brought out an orange peel because they'd just gotten their afternoon fruit and vegetable tray. And then he brought out a quarter of an orange, and a navel orange, so a really big hunk of orange. And I was pretty sure that if I had offered him a choice between a peanut and an orange, he probably would have picked the orange. So that was interesting. Now, the oranges weren't a limited commodity. He was the alpha male and they were inside, but he'd gone to an awful lot of effort to come out and bring it to me. And I got to wondering whether he wanted it only because everybody else had a peanut too. And if so, then that could mean that he was paying attention to their outcomes, and that could lead to, that meant he might have a sense of inequity. And with what I was working on for my dissertation, which as I mentioned at lunch, nobody ever really cites. But I was looking at how the capuchins perceived value and whether they could ascribe value to different tokens and use those tokens meaningfully, which they can. But I came up with the idea of just looking at how they responded when their partner got paid more. And it didn't actually end up being part of my dissertation, which is a whole other story. But we ran the study, and in fact, they cared quite a lot. So they were much more upset when their partner got a better food reward than they did than when they both got the same medium value food reward. And we have since followed up on that for the last 25 years. I often tell my students that I'm not necessarily the best example because you don't have to do what you chose for your dissertation for the rest of your life. It's not a lifetime commitment, but I certainly look like it might be. Yeah.
So that just to maybe elaborate on that, the experiment itself was the capuchins are already trained to exchange some tokens for some food, and the idea is that you have capuchins side by side, and one exchanges a token for a grape, the next one exchanges and gets a cucumber and gets unhappy and starts rattling the cage and throwing the cucumber at. And so this is an example of inequity aversion.
Lance has particularly good aim. Yeah.
I was wondering if the tester had to do any precautions to not get cucumber in the face or something.
Just with Lance.
That's really incredible. As you were talking about the observations, though, so I totally get that. At Kyoto University as well, the professors always ask the students, like, before you even think about what you're going to study or what hypotheses you want to test, just go out there and watch the monkeys in the forest, and the ideas will come to you. So I think that's really fascinating. But I'm wondering how much, so with the cucumber and the grape, clearly the inequity is that the capuchins value one over the other. But you just mentioned that in the observation, it wasn't necessarily that a peanut is valued more than an orange, but there's something about maybe it's a mimetic desire that's fueling that, or had you thought more about that? And have you tried to implement that itself into those kind of inequity experiments as well?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because we also don't know what they're responding to. Are they responding to the fact that I'm giving someone a different reward than they got? Are they responding to the fact that someone has a different reward than they've got? Do they see it as some sort of a joint task and their partner somehow got something better? That's possible, given that oftentimes they do these joint cooperative tasks in the enclosure. So we really aren't sure. In social learning, there seems to be some evidence that they like to imitate others just for the sake of blending in, for fitting in. And so it's not out of the realm of possibility that, yes, they want what everybody else has for that mimetic reason. And we haven't tested that yet. We started looking at something that we knew was measurably inequitable. We know you like grapes better than cucumbers. How do you respond when your partner gets a grape? Right. But one of the things that I'm interested in looking at more is trying to get at these more subtle reactions. And they're harder because our reaction to inequity, or our dependent variable for inequity responses, is giving up a food, which is really hard to do. So a lot of them have it in their hand and then let it go. And we know from a couple of papers that we've published that if it's a good enough food, they won't give it up no matter what their partner got. Right. So I don't think it's that they don't notice when they get when it's inequitable, but if the food is good enough, they can't let go of it, which is probably true with humans too. And so one of the things that we've got to figure out is more subtle designs, like maybe what Ikuma and I have been talking about, looking at emotion, where we can see whether or not they're noticing what's happening, even if they're not willing to give it up. So are we seeing changes in hormone levels, which probably aren't actually fast enough to detect anything? Are we seeing changes in facial temperature? Can we look at eye tracking and use eye tracking to figure out what they're actually looking at and see what they're noticing? There are other subtle ways we could try and get at some of these same questions that don't require them to pitch out something that they like well enough, but not quite as well.
Well, I remember, so I in your field, in experimentation, getting the answer that you want is often quite hard in the fact that there's so many things to control, and there are all these potential confounds that might explain the result you're getting. And I think if I remember correctly, one of the, and maybe you yourself raised it, I'm not sure of the context, but one of the potential problems is that if the capuchins can see that there are grapes there, they may not want the cucumber, regardless of what a capuchin next to them are doing, right? And so, and maybe Kuma, I don't know, if you just think of the original study, you as a cognitive scientist and someone who does experimentation, maybe looking for what are the next steps that you need to, the next experiments you need to do in order to kind of answer those potential alternative explanations for it.
Well, that's somewhat we always try to do, right? Like based on the one finding, what we can do for the next. And if you hit on that kind of question, whether or not the presence of the grape itself might prohibit other individual or the individual to consume the cucumber anymore, then kind of ghost condition, for example, no individual in the next door, but grapes there.
Yeah.
So you see the grape, but you cannot have access to, you don't have access to the grape. What you're going to do with a cucumber in your hand.
Yeah.
That could be one, condition that you can think of.
Yeah.
And maybe that can bring another kind of question. If you do that, then we always try to improve the task. And you cannot conclude only by one experiment usually, but that's a kind of fun part for a cognitive scientist to think about what can be next. So what should we answer next?
Right.
And then maybe we have still this one. Okay, now we have to design something new.
Yeah.
That's a difficult part, but also fun part for the cognitive science.
Do you, when you're designing your experiments, maybe it's a question for both of you, do you have like the voice of your most antagonistic colleague? So predicting what they're going to complain about during reviews. He could be your reviewer number 2. Are you trying to preempt all of the? I'm sure that you would be trying to preempt all of the confounds that might explain the results that you get. But
I tend to send things to friends.
Yeah.
What am I missing? And you can't always get rid of everything. I mean, any well-controlled study is either going to have something that's not ecologically valid or socially valid, or it's going to be missing some control that you just can't do, or it's not going to be properly counterbalanced because you had to run one before you ran the other. We're always trying to make decisions about, well, if we run this control first, are we accidentally training them to prefer this token? We got to run the control. So how many sessions do we run without the control? When do we put them in? How many do we put in? Some controls actually will get if we're doing controls on things like prosocial behavior, the controls where they don't get anything can actually inhibit them from ever being prosocial again.
Right.
So your control works by showing that they're not using it, but then they're not going to come over to the task anymore.
Right.
And especially one of the things I'm interested in is social context. So we've started to do some of these tasks where we've got the entire social group present and we have no control. And so then there's this whole other problem of, do you have enough data from the dyadic context that you can actually interpret the data you're getting from your group?
Right. Yeah. So one thing, I've heard you talk about this before, and I think there's a TED Salon video out there with you talking about the relationship between the sense of fairness that you discover in the capuchins and cooperation, or inequity aversion and cooperation. So you could think of them as kind of like partners, I guess, in that. And so for you, how do you fit that in? So why would, maybe could be from a lay question, why would a capuchin have a sense of fairness, or why would it need to be aware of what others are getting relative to what it's getting? Yeah,
so one of the arguments in favor of one of the arguments for why we would have a sense of fairness, and I don't think capuchins have a sense of fairness, but they notice inequity and they have let's say, elements of the sense of fairness. Is that when you are cooperating with others, you need to know whether you're being taken advantage of. So are you working together and they're taking more of the rewards? Are you doing more of the work? Are you in a situation where you would be better off going and finding someone else to work with? You can think of it as a partner choice mechanism if it encourages you to go find someone new, or partner control if you have any ability whatsoever to change your partner's behavior. And capuchins are highly cooperative. So in the wild, there are reports of them mobbing predators like boa constrictors. They are food sharing. Females are forming these really tight reciprocal relationships. They're even allo nursing each other's infants on occasion. And we see the same sorts of reciprocal relationships in the lab. So they tend to translate. And our colonies also have typical social arrangements. So these females are living with kin. They're living with individuals that have been in the same group that are in the group they were born in. They are living in the same group that they were born in, with individuals who've been there since they were born. So they have the opportunity to develop these really close social ties that should lead to these same sorts of cooperative interactions. And if that's the case, then the sense of inequity would help them recognize when it's time to go find a new social partner, when it's time to maybe stop working with the one they've got. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is figure out whether or not the sense of inequity is showing up more commonly in experiments that include cooperation. So the original study was really, you can almost think of it as a pilot in a sense. It was, do they care if someone else gets more than them? But more recent studies have gotten more nuanced. So have them working together to bring in trays that have food on them, and one of you gets more than the other. Or the rewards are clumped, and so you've got to decide who's going to get what. And try and figure out how inequity is impacting individual decisions about whether or not to cooperate.
So where are we now? Those studies came out, I think, in what would have been like the early 2000s or something.
2003 was the first one.
Yeah, 20 years now, right? So 2 decades. Since that time, how... I'm sorry to date a little bit here. We'll edit that out later. But I'm sure everyone can do the math from 2003.
They can, or they can look at me.
You did show some nice pictures of the younger years from our colleagues.
Well, you already mentioned that we met 20 years ago, right?
Yeah, that's...
I know.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on. But... So what about now? I'm sure these kind of experiments have been replicated in multiple species, and I think I've seen some with chimpanzees, and results can be kind of sometimes mixed, but I think it's been shown that they have this inequity aversion as well. But what other species have been tested, and how far does that actually go? Yeah, there have been lots of studies done on capuchins and chimps in particular, and they are variable, but I think the variability is actually informative. So for instance, they don't tend to respond when you just hand them rewards. And there is maybe some possibility that the orientation of the chimps makes a difference. So in studies where the chimps are across from one another rather than side by side, you don't tend to see a response. We've also got some data suggesting that there's something about the personality of the chimpanzees that may affect responses. Some chimps are more likely to respond to frustration controls, and some are more likely to respond to inequity. I still think that relationship quality has to have something to do with it, but because all of our studies are voluntary participation, we can't get pairs who have low relationship quality to participate. Right. So all I've been able to demonstrate is that relationship quality correlates with who's willing to come in and participate. And I have no idea how it affects inequity. So that one's still in the works. We find that dogs and wolves show inequity responses, sometimes in different ways than the primates do. In their case, they will avoid the individuals who treated them inequitably after the task. I see. There's some evidence that some of the corvids that cooperate will also do the same thing. There's some evidence of macaques doing this. Bonobos do. There's a new paper that just came out of Jeroen Steven's lab with a postdoc whose name that I completely cannot remember right now. And we'll have to edit that part out of it. That shows that bonobos are responding to inequity. Gorillas and orangutans don't. Okay. We haven't found any evidence of it, nor has anybody else. And I suspect that's because they don't tend to show these high levels of cooperation with non-kin. Squirrel monkeys really don't.
Marmosets and tamarins don't. They're interesting. Marmosets and tamarins you would expect because they're pair-bonded wood.
Cooperative breeding.
Yep, cooperative breeding. But I think a lot of the pairs that have been tested, and certainly the ones that I've been involved with, we were using mated pairs.
Yeah.
And so it may be that at that point, the cost of refusing a food or getting frustrated over something is, they weren't doing grapes and cucumbers, but something is inane as a bit of food is maybe not worth it.
Right.
So as we've gathered more data, we found that it is pretty widespread. I would guess it's quite a bit more widespread than that. We just don't have data from other species. Right. Oh, there's a study on rats. Rats also show it, which again, they're highly cooperative. So this isn't necessarily surprising. Yeah. And I think we're going to find that it's more prevalent than we expect. It shouldn't be hard. I think it's an emotional response. You get frustrated, you get irritated, you quit participating.
So one thing that I often bring up with my students, so I teach comparative cognition at Kyoto University, the class that I inherited. I don't have a background in it, but I've learned a ton since starting to teach it from people like yourself. And one thing that we often talk about is, so this idea of inequity aversion is very much connected to pro-social behavior, cooperation, even altruism. And then there are some strategies that individuals might take in their relationships with others. But one thing that it's often mentioned that doesn't exist outside of humans is the idea of spite, or like holding grudges, this kind of, and then, performing actions that benefit neither, but maybe make you feel good because you're spiting another person. And I wonder when you watch the video of the capuchins, like refusing cucumbers, that's not an example of spite, but I wonder if there could be, even, because we don't expect inequity aversion, we can explain using evolutionary biology, especially if it's connected to cooperation and exploitation. But spite would be somehow different. So that would be harder to explain.
Spite would only work if by paying the cost to punish someone else even more, you got a longer term gain. So if I am Lance, the capuchin monkey who's throwing that cucumber out, and by continuing to do so, I can change your behavior and then gain a long-term cooperative benefit, then it might be worth it. The problem is that you've got to have, I would suspect that you're going to find it more in species that can understand that sort of relationship. Same with actually advantageous inequity aversion. So there's some evidence that chimps maybe care when they get less than a partner. More than a partner. And humans certainly do. Not as much as we care when we get less. But we notice when we get more. And one of the arguments for that is if you have a long-term cooperative relationship and you're continuing to get more, if you're smart enough to know that that's going to upset your partner and they're going to quit participating, you're going to lose that cooperative relationship. So it is in your best interest to pay a short-term cost in order to maintain that cooperative relationship. And a similar argument could be made for spite. If you had no ability to show partner choice, if you can't go off and find a new partner, but by being spiteful, you could change your partner's behavior, it might be worth it.
Has that ever been witnessed, observed, tested for?
Not that I know of. There's a really nice study by Keith Jensen looking at revenge. I think he called it revenge instead of spite. Chimps were given a plate of food and then a partner chimp could pull it over to them. And at that point, they had the option to collapse the table and keep their partner from getting it.
Right.
And they did. But if a human came in and moved the food, they didn't collapse the table. So they seemed to understand intent, which it was a really nice study. Yeah. And that's not quite spite. I'd call that revenge. But
it's on a similar line, though.
Getting close. Yeah. And it's certainly controlling your partner's behavior by doing something. It's only minimally costly, which is why it isn't spite, but it's controlling your partner's behavior.
Yeah, it's super interesting. But I think that's a good segue into what you talked about today in your seminar, which is about comparative economics, which in your experiments that you showed requires, in many cases, a lot of cooperation in order to get to, let's say, the best, or the dominant reward, as you called it, the best payoff situation. So maybe to kind of get us going in that direction, you could talk about what is comparative economics. Sometimes I've heard also people talk about monkeynomics, but what is comparative economics, and what do you hope to learn from it?
Yeah. So about 20 something years ago, maybe longer than that now, economics spawned this branch called experimental economics. There's also closely related behavioral economics. But the idea behind experimental economics was that rather than armchair theorizing, let's get out and test what people are actually doing when they make economic decisions. But importantly, a lot of this was based on some pretty basic decisions. So let's see whether people cooperate or defect. Let's see whether or not people will punish others. So that's where a lot of these games like the ultimatum game came from, Prisoner's Dilemma, and so forth. And the glory of these games is they're very standardized and they're very simple. And they often are dichotomous choices, which lots of different species can do if you can figure out how to present it in a way that they can understand. And so we, about close to 20 years ago, more like 15 years ago, Bart Wilson and colleagues and I came up with the idea of running this with other species. Other people have done this as well. But we have had, over the last 15 years, a very rigorous program of using exactly the same procedures on both computers, tasks, and on comparative tasks using token exchanges with humans. And then I think we're up to 4 non-human primate species now. Mm-hmm. And test exactly the same games across all those different species and see how they compare. So we don't give the humans instructions, and we pay them trial by trial, just like we do with the non-human primates. And we are it's comparative experimental economics. We are trying to compare across species and use that as a foundation to start hypothesis testing about what are the species similarities and differences. Obviously, this is a model system. You're not going to see them trading in the wild. But I think it can be really... And we also don't know that they all experience it the same way just because we present it the same way. That's important to point out, too. But it's as close as we can get. So we can present them with identical situations, see how they respond, and then we can start going in and adding social relevance. We can go start adding ecological validity, and then we can go back in and back test it using traditional BARPL tasks, doing field observations, and so forth to try and figure out if they're meeting what we would predict based on these results.
Mm-hmm. So the economic behaviors, that's an expression I've heard a few times too. And I just wonder if maybe before we go on, you could explain. So you explained why we might expect something like inequity aversion in social, like highly social animals who have these reciprocal interactions in long-term relationships with each other. But what are the kind of other like economic behaviors that you could imagine?
I mean, at its most basic, it's decision making. I mean, any animal that has to choose whether it wants the food it likes better that's a little further away or the food it likes less well that's right here is making an economic decision. And I think that we are... I'm going to back up. So when we talk about humans, we tend to think about economics as a very complex sort of thing. We have banks and financial systems and so forth. But at heart, it really is about determining where your values are and value in terms of actual value, not your value system, and making decisions based on maximizing your outcomes, maximizing your utility. It's called in economics. And other species are doing that as well. And so we're interested in the same sorts of decisions. Do you cooperate? What happens if you've got a conflict situation where you have to work against one another? How are you making these sorts of decisions? A lot of behavioral ecology has been using these same sorts of models that really are about decision making and maximizing your outcomes for a long time. Yeah. It's just that in this case, we're directly comparing them to humans, trying to use the same, trying to really understand the evolution of human behaviors by looking at what these other species are doing. Mm.
So before getting into the what the non-human primates were doing, what you found in your experiments, I want to just stick a pin in the human side of it, because it's also an interesting concept for most humans. When they go into experimental studies like that, they're given a set of instructions or something, and you kind of know what you're supposed to do and what the game's about. So and then you said something interesting in your talk, that you only used students who had experience doing the psychology experiments or behavioral economic experiments in that university to try and match that the cohort of humans with your capuchins who also spend a lot of time in doing experiments.
They do.
Yeah. So can you maybe walk us through that? Like, why is that an important aspect of the study for you, not to use like naive university students?
Yeah. The our primates come in with a set of expectations. So when they decide in the morning that they're willing to come into a test box, they're assuming that they're going to be participating in some sort of game that they will get rewarded for. And they also assume that they're going to get to keep those rewards because we give them food. And a lot of humans in undergrads have had lots of experience. And in psychology labs, sometimes they often do. It's often just make a decision, but you don't actually get to keep it. So they are, you're given some sort of a story and you make a decision about what you would do, but it's not actually changing your behavior in any way. So, and the other thing is there's often deception in the psychology labs. And so we were running in an econ lab where there was no deception. What we told them we were going to do, we were actually going to do. And we were giving them what we promised. So if you earn $35, you were going to walk out the door with $35. So at its most basic, we needed them to believe us without us telling them, because we didn't want to be giving them a whole lot of instruction. And we also wanted them to come in with the same set of underlying expectations because we wanted them to be working hard to maximize their outcomes. So if they came to the lab going, oh, good, I get to go back to that lab where I earn a lot of money, then hopefully they would come in primed to look carefully and maximize their earnings, just like our monkeys are doing.
Right. So there's a bit of inequity with the university students as to which experiments they're allowed to participate in there and to get their economic rewards. But what maybe I wanted to ask you, what were you kind of most surprised about when you saw the results of the human experiments with not having any instructions? Was there anything that really stuck out?
Yeah. So one of the first tasks we did was a coordination task. It's called the stag-hunt or the assurance game. And you can coordinate on a high-paying outcome and get $1, or you could coordinate on a low-paying outcome and get $0.25. But if you didn't coordinate, if one person played the high-paying outcome, which was stag, and one person played the low-paying outcome, whoever played stag got nothing. So playing hare was safe. You always got your $0.25. And a remarkably large percentage of our students ended up playing the low-paying hare outcome rather than the high-paying stag outcome, which is what all of our primates settled on, non-human primates. But when we looked back at it, what happened was they started playing, and they would start with one playing stag and one playing hare, and the one who played hare got $0.25, and they might switch on the next one. And they very quickly decided that the right decision was to both play hare. So they never experienced stag. Whereas our primates were much more likely to explore the parameter space and to continue exploring for some time. So they all experienced stag. So sooner or later, they settled on it. It took them longer to get there, but because they had been more exploratory in the first place, they were more likely to find these other solutions. So the humans looked really not very bright, but I think it was because we put them in this weird situation where we didn't give them instruction and they weren't speaking to one another, which are the primary mechanisms by which humans acquire information. And they thought they'd solved it, so they didn't look any further.
Right.
Later on, we had a more complex task, the chicken game or the hawk-dove game, where the solution is much more complicated and there is no obvious solution where you both win. There's nothing with an easy payoff where everybody's getting the same thing. And they did really well on that one. But I think it was because they didn't think they'd found it, and so they kept looking until they found the solution.
In those experiments, so you had, as you mentioned, maybe 4 or 5 different primates, and that includes humans, and some of them were doing better than others. So you mentioned that humans are maybe not so bright in this stag hunt because they kept, by not exploring, they kept kind of falling on this kind of mediocre result and seemingly being happy with that. Whereas on the other hand, you had rhesus macaques who were just kind of blowing all the other species out of the water, always converging on the kind of best option. So if you're a listener and you're thinking, clearly rhesus macaques are smarter than humans, right?
Maybe not.
What's going on there?
Well, it turns out that the rhesus and the humans are using a very different mechanism to get at these outcomes. So the rhesus monkeys seem to have just figured out that we did some controls where they had to play a simulation. And based on that, the rhesus monkeys seem to have just decided that stag is the best outcome and you should always play stag no matter what your partner is doing. Which is interesting because in humans, if your partner kept cheating on you, you would see it as cheating, but that's apparently not what the rhesus were internalizing here because they continued playing stag. Humans probability matched. So Humans were matching the frequency of stag play with the frequency of stag play of the simulation. And so they ended up with equally high levels of success because the rhesus tended to be paired with individuals who were also playing a lot of stag.
Right.
But they were getting there in entirely different ways. And it's interesting, too, that rhesus can probability match. They're perfectly capable of doing that, but they weren't doing so in this game. Mm-hmm. So that's a really nice example of how you can get to the same outcome, but you can get there using entirely different mechanisms. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the human's mechanism is more flexible. So in subsequent games, the humans were much more likely to find outcomes more easily because they were adapting around what their partner was doing, whereas the rhesus monkeys were playing a much less flexible strategy. It's a rule of thumb. This generally works, so we're going to stick with it.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting. That I find that fascinating that, first of all, that on average, they can do relatively similarly well. And so it's kind of clear evidence that there's not only one solution. But then when you dig a little bit deeper, as you did, and you show how the strategies are so different. And so I kind of wonder, like, how often when we study, and especially in comparative cognition, you often base conclusions on what we can see and the outcomes. And it's not always clear whether what's going on in behind the scene is the same. So I wonder if you can maybe comment on that, and maybe Kuma too, you can come back to that. Like how should we interpret that? How should we view the outcomes of experiments that we have, knowing sometimes that the mechanism to get there might be completely different?
Well, I think it's important to specify when you're talking about outcome versus mechanism. Mm-hmm. And I think it's fine as long as you're clear on that. Mm-hmm. Mechanism may not be the same, might be the same, and sometimes we can't know. There's no way to test it. But where I see confusion is when people talk about what they found without specifying that this was the behavior we found, or this was the outcome we found, or they mix up they mix up their terminology. Mm. And as long as you are very clear, then it's fine. Same outcome, different mechanism. You can have the same mechanism lead to different outcomes too. Mm-hmm. I didn't have any evidence of that, but there's no reason why you couldn't see that as well. And it's just being careful with your terminology.
I agree. And that's a perfect example, why we want to have so many conditions to clarify which is the underlying mechanism for a certain behavior or cognitive judgment that they make, right? And, it's kind of very rare case that overall performance is so close, but completely rely on a different mechanism. That's a very great example given by Sarah today. But, even without having a different performance in a different level, we still want to seek for what is the underlying mechanism, what brings that difference. So we still take the same approach, preparing the multiple conditions to see what is the point that they have a difference, Mm-hmm.
I do use that example every single time I want to talk about same outcome, different mechanism, because mm-hmm. it's one of the clearest ones I've ever seen.
Yeah, that's a perfect example, I think.
So maybe I just have one last question before we close this out. And I'm sorry it's been so short. I definitely wish we had a lot more time for this. But and maybe you can just decline to answer this question. I'll throw it out to both of you. Or it might be a super, maybe I think it's a complex question, but it's really naive and silly. But one thing that struck me when you are having humans doing the experiments in the same way as non-human primates, you've taken away language. I think you said that language often complicates our interaction in the way, and not only our interaction, but how we perceive how we've done something, right? Just by explaining it to ourselves, we can kind of alter the way we think of how it actually, what mechanisms we used, for mm-hmm. example. And we might make it, I think Frans de Waal also talks about this a lot, how humans have a really high opinion of ourselves and our abilities. But a lot of times when you break it down to components, what we do is quite similar to what the other species are doing. Okay, so that's part one. Part two is in social psychology, and then probably in a lot of behavioral economics as well, you have this kind of big issue now with the replication crisis. And I'm wondering if there's a connection there. So I wonder if having the humans come into the experiments without the expectations, they can still communicate with each other, but without kind of complicating that situation and making it more like the experiments you would do with non-human primates. Do you think this is something that can help in that kind of broad sense of understanding the underlying mechanisms of why we make decisions?
It might. I think one of the take-home messages from working with primates is that you can get different results when everybody's doing everything right. Just because somebody found a different outcome doesn't mean that somebody did something wrong. Mm-hmm. It can mean that the social context is different. It can mean that your primates have different preferences. It can mean that one person tested more dominant animals. There is an incredibly large amount of data coming out now showing that the rewards you use matter immensely. Mm-hmm. What value, whether it's a relatively high value reward or a relatively low value reward. Mann Schweinfarth has a nice paper she just published recently arguing that it matters what sort of feeding schedule the animals are on, how they respond to some of these tasks, whether they get fed on a rate, whether they're getting fed multiple times per day and getting lots of treats actually makes them more likely to respond to some inequity tasks. So there are so many things that the animals are sensitive to. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, I think removing any of the instruction and so forth just automatically takes away some factors that can be variable across different studies. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it does mean, though, that you may have less control. They're bringing in other things that you don't know about or can't control for. So I would say that you probably want to mix them to some degree. But if anything, I would say for the replication crisis, thinking about primates, I think we're better about taking into account variability. Mm-hmm. And we're better about thinking about what it was about our study that made the outcomes different and why is it important? Why did we find this? It's not that, it didn't replicate. Well, maybe, don't get me wrong, there are things that didn't replicate and shouldn't have replicated. But if something doesn't, what is it? Why is ours different than yours?
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Without language, instruction clearly before the experiment, that could help to some extent. But also, if you have a specific instruction by the language, you can also set a certain condition by doing that. So I guess both can be mixed or both can be used together. And then you can actually see the difference or similarity. And that can actually bring up the new door, like what can be actually the mechanism behind for that certain component, or this can be modified by if you have this kind of additional information. And as Sarah mentioned, I guess primate work is we still have problem for the replication sometime, but we can pin down to some extent. All right, let's see the difference for the whole population or setting or task. So we are kind of practicing to pin down what, and actually difference could be interesting. Mm-hmm. So replication, we love to see the replication, but if we fail, it can actually bring the new question. Mm-hmm. And we don't have to be super negative for that failure in replication, but we need to understand. Mm-hmm. We try to put the effort to understand at least, why different result can come from the different place or different population.
All right, I lied. This is my final question. You can keep it short.
I saw you said that too.
Sarah, I think in your career, you've answered some really interesting questions, and you've created some really interesting studies and designed some fascinating experiments, and continuing to do so. So my last question for you is, what is the question right now that's really motivating you that you want to kind of find out, or you want to work towards, or you want to get? Maybe it's something you'll find out next week, or maybe it's in another 20 years.
This is probably a 20-year question. Okay. I want to know how the social environment is influencing all these decisions we're finding in the lab. Mm-hmm. So we're doing everything we can to use species-typical social groups. And we're asking questions that I don't think you can find by just doing field work. I do some field work, so I think it's really important too. But we do things like, okay, we're bringing in dyad A with B, and then we're going to bring in A with C, and then we're going to bring in A with D, and we're going to see what happens. But that's not the same as having everybody there. That's not the same as having everybody present. And so that's the direction we're going now, is trying to figure out what's going on and try and incorporate all this. Let's look at the hormones. Let's look at their social behavior. So we do observations on every group 4 times a week, and we do a focal follow on every monkey every week. So we know a lot about their behavior and their relationships, and try and bring all of that in to explain some of the individual differences we're seeing. I don't think we're going to be able to answer this individual differences question without having all of those data. But we can't ask these big questions at the social group level until we understand enough about what's going on individually and with the dyads to be able to interpret the data we're getting, because they're messy. You can't just run 30 trials with each monkey, because that's not the way it works when you let the whole social group come up and participate. So that's what we're working on, is trying to figure out how to do that in a sufficiently reliable way that we can actually start to say something about how these social relationships are affecting behavior.
Fascinating. Wish you the best of luck with that, Dr. Sarah Brosnan and Dr. Hikumura Adachi. Thank you for joining me on the PrimateCast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thanks for listening to the PrimateCast. The podcast is hosted and produced by me, Dr. Andrew McIntosh, Senior Scientist for Wildlife Conservation at the Wilder Institute, Calgary Zoo, formerly Associate Professor of Biological Sciences at Kyoto University. Join me for new episodes as often as I can get them out on whatever podcast platform you prefer. Leave a rating or a review of the show to help other listeners find it. Connect with me through our website, theprimatecast.info, or social media on X, Facebook, or Instagram. Feel free to comment, ask questions, suggest future guests, or share whatever else might be on your mind. If you value the show, consider donating or becoming a member. You can do so by visiting theprimatecast.info and clicking on the big yellow Buy Me a Mic button, which takes you to our campaign page. Or you could click on that little heart icon next to the social media links in your podcast player, or on the text link in the show notes. Your support will help cover production costs and is essential to ensure that I can continue to produce quality informational and inspirational interviews with leading figures in the field long into the future.